They say the truth will set you free, but they never tell you how much it costs to speak it first. In a house built on faith, Darcy is about to find out if the truth is enough to bring down a giant, or if she'll be the one crushed under the weight of the temple walls. Before we get started, make sure you hit the subscribe button and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming faith-based stories that will challenge your heart, strengthen your resolve, and remind you that even in the darkest corners, the light of truth always finds a way. Now sit back and enjoy the story, and if you do, hit the like button. Darcy couldn't do this for one more church service. The sanctuary was already too much. Narrow aisles that forced people to squeeze past each other, pews packed so tightly her knees nearly touched the row ahead, and a ceiling so low it felt like it pressed down on her thoughts. Warm, still air clung to her skin, carrying the mixed scents of old carpet, candle wax, and too many perfumes blending into something suffocating. And then there was him. Standing at the front of the sanctuary was Elder Scrolls, and seeing him made her skin crawl. The pulpit felt impossibly close in a room this small, as if he were looming over every person at once. Colored light from the stained glass windows fractured across his face, turning his expression unreadable, or maybe just making the unease she felt sharpen into something she could no longer ignore. To everyone else, he looked like a pillar of calm authority. To Darcy, he felt like a shadow she couldn't step out of. His eyes found her the moment she walked in, they always did. A lingering look that lasted a beat too long, like he was taking inventory of her instead of greeting a member of the congregation. She felt it even across the room, a slow crawl along her spine. Worse were the embraces. He hugged everyone, but with her, his hand stayed a moment longer on her back, his voice dropping to a murmur meant only for her. She had tried to convince herself she was imagining it, that she was overreacting, but the tightness in her chest every week told her otherwise. Now, as he stood at the pulpit in this cramped sanctuary, he felt impossibly close, as if the room itself was conspiring to keep her within his reach. Darcy tried to focus on the Bible in her lap, but the words blurred. Elder Scrolls' voice rolled through the cramped sanctuary, warm and practiced, filling every inch of the low ceiling. People around her nodded along, unaware of the way her pulse hammered. Then he did it. In the middle of his sermon, Elder Scrolls paused, scanning the congregation with that slow, deliberate sweep he always used. But this time he didn't move on. His gaze stopped on her, held her, long enough that the people beside her shifted, glancing her way as if they felt the weight of it too. Her stomach tightened. He smiled. Not the broad, welcoming smile he gave the room. A smaller one. Private. The kind he'd given her last week when his hand lingered too long between her shoulder blades. A murmur rippled through the pews. He was still staring. Darcy's breath caught. For the first time, she wasn't the only one who noticed. Mrs. Halpern, 2 seats down, frowned and whispered something to her husband. A teenager in the back row snorted under his breath. Even the choir members exchanged quick, uncertain looks. Elder Scrolls blinked, as if realizing he'd slipped, and cleared his throat. "Let us continue," he said, but his voice had lost its rhythm. The sanctuary felt even smaller now, the air thicker, the pews tighter. Darcy's hands trembled against the hymn book. Something had shifted, not just in her, but in the room. People had seen. People had noticed. For the first time, she wasn't alone with this. And that changed everything. Darcy's hands wouldn't stop shaking. The Bible felt too heavy, the air too thick, Elder Scrolls' stare too direct. She couldn't sit through another minute of this. She snapped the book shut and stood. The movement was small, but in the cramped sanctuary, it felt loud. A few heads turned. Elder Scrolls' voice faltered mid-sentence. Darcy didn't wait. She slipped into the aisle, squeezing past knees and whispered apologies, her pulse thudding in her ears. The sanctuary's narrow aisle felt like a tunnel closing in, but the exit sign glowed ahead like a lifeline. She pushed through the heavy doors and stepped into the cool air of the vestibule, then out onto the church steps. Only when the door clicked shut behind her did she finally breathe. But she wasn't alone. Footsteps hurried after her, and the door opened again. Mrs. Halpern, the same woman who'd frowned during the sermon, stepped out, her face lined with concern. "Darcy," she said softly, not grabbing her arm, not crowding her, just standing close enough to show she cared. "Are you all right?" Darcy swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight, but the question, simple, genuine, cracked something open inside her. Mrs. Halpern glanced back at the sanctuary doors, then at Darcy again. "I saw the way he looked at you. That wasn't appropriate." The words hit Darcy like a jolt. Someone else had seen. Someone else had named it. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel trapped. She felt seen. Darcy didn't mean to cry. She wasn't even sure she was crying until she felt the cool air hit her face and realized her vision had gone blurry. Mrs. Halpern stayed a respectful distance away, hands folded in front of her, giving Darcy space but not abandoning her to the church steps. Darcy wiped at her cheek with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. "You don't need to be sorry," Mrs. Halpern said gently. "You walked out because something wasn't right. That undid her more than anything." Darcy let out a shaky breath, the kind that had been trapped in her chest for weeks. "It's not just today," she said. "It's been happening for a while." Mrs. Halpern nodded, encouraging but not pushing. "He looks at me," Darcy continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not like a pastor should. Not like he looks at anyone else. And when he hugs me," she stopped, pressing her lips together. "It's too long. Too close. I keep telling myself I'm imagining it, but I'm not. I know I'm not." Mrs. Halpern's expression tightened with concern, not disbelief. "You're not imagining it," she said. "I've noticed the way he watches you. And I'm not the only one." Darcy's breath caught. "You're not?"
"No."
Mrs. Halpern shook her head slowly. "A few of us have had questions. But today was the first time he made it so obvious." The relief that washed through Darcy wasn't clean or simple. It was tangled with fear, anger, and the sudden realization that she didn't have to carry this alone. "I didn't know who to talk to," Darcy admitted. "I didn't want to cause trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Mrs. Halpern said firmly. "You're telling the truth. And the truth deserves to be heard." Darcy looked back at the sanctuary doors, the muffled hum of the service, still drifting through them. For the first time, the building didn't feel like a place she had to escape from. It felt like a place where something might finally change. Mrs. Halpern stepped a little closer, her voice steady. "You don't have to decide anything right now. But you don't have to face this by yourself anymore. God allowed it to happen today how it did, so that you and your story would be believed." Darcy exhaled a long, trembling breath that felt like the first real one she'd taken all morning.
"Thank you," she said.
And she meant it. 2 weeks passed, and the gossip in the church grew. More and more young ladies came out and spoke of similar, lingering moments. It started as a trickle, a quiet conversation in a kitchen, a tearful confession during a youth group retreat, and turned into a flood. What Darcy had thought was a private burden was actually a shared secret, whispered in the corners of the pews for years. One girl spoke of an accidental touch during a prayer session. Another mentioned a series of late-night texts that felt increasingly less like spiritual guidance and more like a pursuit. He sent messages asking if she was staying pure or if she was thinking of him during her private devotions. As the days passed, the pattern became undeniable. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a blueprint. He would pull them aside for special mentorship, claiming they had a unique spiritual sensitivity that others lacked. It always started with a hand on a shoulder that stayed too long, or a compliment that felt like a caress. If they didn't flinch, he moved closer. If any girl expressed discomfort, he would pivot to scripture, suggesting their worldly thoughts were twisting his fatherly affection. The most heartbreaking revelation came from a woman in her 40s, a pillar of the choir. "I thought I was the only one 20 years ago," she shared. "He told me I was his secret crown. I've carried that shame since I was 19. The realization hit Darcy like a physical blow. By staying silent, the community hadn't just protected a man, they had inadvertently curated a hunting ground. The trouble Darcy had been so afraid of causing wasn't a fire she was starting, it was a fire that had been smoldering under the floorboards for decades. On the third Sunday, the sanctuary was packed, but the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of respect, it was the silence of an ultimatum. The pastor stood at the pulpit, his smile practiced and tight, but his eyes darted toward the back row where Darcy sat. She wasn't hiding today. She sat flanked by Mrs. Halpern and 3 other women, their presence forming a physical wall of support. When he cleared his throat to begin his sermon on forgiveness and the dangers of gossip, Mrs. Halpern didn't wait. She stood up. "We aren't here for a lecture on silence, Pastor," she said, her voice ringing clearly off the stained glass. The pastor froze, his hand hovering over the edge of the pulpit. For a moment, his professional mask flickered, a flash of irritation, then a practiced look of wounded concern. "Mrs. Halpern," he said, his voice smooth and paternal, "this is the Lord's house. If you have a grievance, the scriptures tell us to bring it in private, not to disrupt." "We tried private," a younger voice interrupted. It was Elena, standing up beside Darcy. Then Sarah stood. Then the woman from the choir. One by one, a dozen women rose like a slow-moving tide. The pastor's face went pale. He looked out at the congregation, searching for his usual allies among the elders, but even they were looking at the floor or at the women, their faces etched with a grim, dawning realization. The gossip had reached their ears too, and the wall of silence he had built over decades was crumbling in real time. Mrs. Halpern stepped into the aisle, holding the yellow legal pad Darcy had seen her carrying all week. "We have the dates, Pastor. We have the messages. And more importantly, we have each other," she said. "We aren't here to whisper anymore. We are here to ask if you have the courage to be the man you claim to be behind this pulpit." The silence that followed was suffocating. Darcy felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she didn't look away. She watched the pastor's hands. They were shaking. He looked down at his Bible, then back at the sea of standing women. He opened his mouth to offer a platitude, a defense about misunderstood intentions, but the sight of Darcy's steady, tearless gaze seemed to snap something inside him. The weight of 20 years of secrets, now brought into the light of a Sunday morning, was too heavy to hold up. A meeting followed the church service, was held in the church basement, and lasted 6 hours. It was grueling, messy, and at times, heartbreaking. There were those who tried to defend him, citing his good works, but their voices were drowned out by the sheer weight of the testimony. As the hours dragged on, the good works defense began to crumble. One elder, his voice shaking, had tried to quote 1 Chronicles 16 verse 22, "Touch not mine anointed," in a desperate bid to shield the pastor. But Mrs. Halpern had stood firm, her Bible open to Matthew 18 verse 6. She read it with a chilling, steady authority. "But whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea." The room had gone silent then. The anointed were not above the law of love and protection. By the time the sun began to set, the following things had changed. The elder board placed elder scrolls, and the pastor on immediate, indefinite leave pending a full investigation by the regional council. No leader was permitted to be alone with a female congregant behind closed doors. "The light must reach every corner," Mrs. Halpern decreed. The board redirected the pastor's travel budget into a fund for professional, trauma-informed counseling for Darcy and the others. A formal committee was established to rewrite the church's safety policies and provide counseling resources for the victims. As the meeting finally adjourned, Darcy walked up the narrow stairs from the basement. She found the pastor sitting alone in the dark sanctuary, his head in his hands. He looked up as she approached, the shadow of the pulpit falling across his face. "I didn't know, but I should have seen the signs," he rasped. Darcy stopped a few feet away. She didn't feel the surge of fear she expected. Instead, she felt a strange, quiet pity. He wasn't hiding. His sins were in plain sight, and it had to end, period, she said. "The truth is the only thing that can set you free now, too." She thought of Numbers 32 verse 23, a verse she had feared for weeks but now found comfort in. Your sin will find you out. He nodded slowly, a single, painful movement. He didn't try to touch her or offer a hollow blessing. He simply gathered his coat and walked out the back door into the cool evening air. Darcy stood in the center aisle, the silence of the church finally feeling sacred again. Mrs. Halpern came up behind her, placing a gentle, appropriate hand on her shoulder. You did a hard thing today, Darcy, she whispered. Psalm 34 verse 18 says the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He was in that basement tonight. Darcy took a deep breath. The weight wasn't gone. Healing would take a long time, but it was no longer hers to carry alone. She looked at the altar, then at the doors, and for the first time in her life, she walked out into the world feeling like the truth had finally made her whole. Thank you for listening and for joining us for today's journey. If this story touched you or reminded you of the power of standing in the light, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. This story is more than a narrative of one girl's courage. It is a mirror held up to the places where we live, work, and worship. To listen to Darcy's story and remain unchanged is to leave the sanctuary doors closed while the truth is crying out on the steps. If you have listened to this story, you now have a mission. Pay attention to the first whisper. Do not wait for a flood of testimonies before you lend your ear. The enemy of justice is the phrase. Are you sure you didn't misunderstand? When someone has the courage to speak, honor that courage with the assumption of truth. Refuse to weaponize forgiveness. Forgiveness is a spiritual grace, but it is not a legal or institutional shield. Never use the concept of mercy to bypass accountability. Repentance requires a complete surrender of power and a willingness to face the consequences. Dismantle the pedestals. We are often tempted to protect a leader's good works at the expense of their victims. Remember that no amount of public ministry can atone for private harm. A pulpit is not a fortress, and a title is not a license. Ensure that your community is built on the word, not on the personality of a single person. Mrs. Halpern, Darcy did not find her voice in a vacuum. She found it because someone was willing to stand in the gap. The goal of exposing darkness is not to destroy the church, but to purify it. Ephesians 5 verse 11 instructs us, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. Light is the best disinfectant. By speaking out, you are not hurting the Lord's house. You are clearing the debris so that it can truly become a place of refuge again. Share a comment in the chat. Your voice matters too, and may be able to help someone find theirs. Thank you for spending this moment with me on Threads of Grace. As you go, remember, grace isn't something you chase. It's something you walk in. May you be covered, guided, and gently reminded that God is present in every thread of your story. Until next time, keep walking in grace.